They came to save us from the sun. We made them apply it themselves. The creek ran low that August, the kind of low that exposed pale flat stones and made the water look like liquid glass poured over gravel. Mara Okafor had her boots off and her feet in it anyway, the cold pulling the ache out of her ankles, the sun pressing down on the crown of her head like a warm and indifferent hand. "Your shoulders are going to peel," said Dex, not looking up from where he lay flat on the bank, with his arm draped over his eyes. He was 26, lanky in a way that looked uncomfortable rather than elegant, and he had the particular stillness of a man who had decided the day owed him nothing. "They always peel," Mara said, "and then they're fine. That's not how skin works. It works fine for me." The creek bend was theirs most afternoons. A quarter-mile off the access road, through a stand of cottonwoods, no trail markers, no fire rings, no evidence that anyone else had ever thought to come here. Mara had found it the summer she turned 19, during the weeks after her mother's funeral, when she'd needed somewhere to put herself that wasn't a room full of casseroles and condolences. She'd been coming back ever since. She'd started bringing Dex 2 years ago, when he'd stopped sleeping after his second deployment, and needed somewhere that wasn't loud. They had a rhythm. She read. He didn't. She brought her sunscreen SPF 45, the kind that smelled like coconut and nostalgia. He tolerated her applying it to his shoulders with the resigned dignity of a man who had survived things that ought to have mattered more than sunburn, and somehow couldn't muster the logic to argue the point. She was working through a field guide to regional geology, not because she needed to know it, but because it gave her something to hold. She was on a chapter about ancient lake beds when the shadow fell across the page. She looked up. It was not a person. Or it was, but it was the way that a rough sketch is a person, the proportions suggested, the details still being worked out. Tall, thin in the upper body and wider at the base than should have been ergonomically sound. Skin the color of old pewter, matte and dry-looking, textured at the forearms like the bark of a tree that has weathered several decades of bad winters. No ears that she could find. Eyes that were present and tracking, and an unsettling shade of amber that was not quite the amber of any animal she'd seen. It stood at the tree line. It was looking at them in a way that suggested it was waiting to see what they would do. Dex had sat up. He'd done it, quietly and quickly, without any of the scrambling a different person might have done. He'd been trained to wake up fast. He was awake now. "Mara," he said, "I see it." "Yeah." Neither of them moved. The thing at the tree line tilted its head at a degree that was slightly too far for a human neck and made a sound that was not language, and then was, the way a radio locks onto a frequency after a moment of static. "I have been miscalibrating," it said. The voice came from somewhere central in its chest rather than its face. "The acoustic modeling of your languages required more iterations than projected. I apologize for the delay." "Okay," Mara said, because she had to say something and this seemed safest. "I am Suro," it said. "I have come from the fourth closest stellar body to your system that supports complex organisms. The journey was longer than comfortable. I have items to present." It was carrying something. A case of some kind, matte and dark, that it held the way a person holds a briefcase on a day they're not sure will go well. It walked toward them. It moved wrong, not badly, but as though it had studied walking from a description rather than a demonstration, each step considered and placed. It stopped 6 feet away. It set the case down on a flat stone. It opened it. Inside were rows of containers. Smooth cylinders, no labels, sealed at both ends. The contents were pale and faintly iridescent, catching the light the way oil on water does, but more gently. "Your star," Suro said, "is in a phase of heightened output. The layer of your atmosphere that filters its most damaging radiation has been thinning for several decades, at a rate that will, within 2 generations, make your surface environments acutely hostile to organisms with your particular cellular structure. You are already experiencing early indicators. You likely do not know how to read them." "We know," Mara said. Suro paused. "You know, the ozone layer, yes. We've known for a while." Suro made a sound that might have been recalibration. "Your collective response has been inadequate. We know that too. Longer this time." You know that it is inadequate. Knowing a thing and fixing a thing, Dex said, are two different problems. Suro looked at him. The amber eyes tracked him with an attention that was not human, but was undeniably intelligent. That is, it said, a more sophisticated observation than my pre-contact models predicted. People keep saying that, Dex said. It doesn't make us feel as good as you'd think. Suro returned its attention to the case. This compound, it said, was developed through cooperative research across 6 species over the course of what you would calculate as approximately 400 years. It is a topical barrier agent. It operates at the molecular level. It does not merely reflect or absorb radiation. It converts incoming ultraviolet energy into a harmless thermal gradient that disperses through the skin's surface layers without accumulating. At the concentrations I carry, a single application lasts 72 of your hours. Mass production is scalable using elements present in your planet's crust. Mara looked at the cylinders. She looked at Suro, she looked at Dex. So it's sunscreen, Dex said. That is, Suro said, a significant oversimplification. But that's what it does. Suro appeared to consider whether to contest this. It decided against. In essence, it said, yes. And you came from 4 light years away, the 4th closest, to bring us sunscreen. The amber eyes blinked, each eyelid moving from the outside in rather than from the top down. I came, Suro said carefully, to preserve your species' viability on your home planet's surface for the duration of the atmospheric recovery period, which my calculations suggest will require approximately 300 years under optimal conditions. This compound would render the surface habitable throughout that period at no meaningful biological cost to your population. Okay, Mara said, but practically speaking, what does it do? A pause. It is sunscreen, Suro said, at a functional protection level that your own cataloging systems would denote as. A flicker of something moved through its features, the first expression she'd seen that felt involuntary. 2000. SPF 2000, Mara said. That designation is technically inaccurate relative to how your rating system was calibrated, but yeah, yes. Mara looked at the cylinders again, at Suro. She reached out and picked up one of the containers. It was lighter than she'd expected and slightly warm. The way a stone gets when it's been in the sun for hours. She turned it over in her hands. No seam she could find. She tilted it and something shifted inside, not liquid exactly, but not solid. Somewhere in between. How do I open it? Suro reached over and pressed 2 fingers at a specific point on the cylinder's side. The top released with a soft sound like an exhale. Inside was the substance. It looked like a very pale clay, or like the first few seconds of a sunrise, that barely there pink before the color decides what it's going to be. She touched it with one fingertip. It absorbed immediately, not greasy, not heavy, just gone into the skin. Huh, she said. Dex leaned over and looked at her fingertip. You just put alien material on your body, he said. It didn't immediately hurt. That's your bar? My bar adapts to circumstances. She held her hand out to the light. Her fingertip looked the same, felt the same. She could feel the sun on the back of her hand, and it felt exactly as it always did. Warm, present, but there was something under that, some quality of the light that she thought she might be imagining, but maybe wasn't. Something that felt like the heat had been sorted somehow. Like the thing that burned had been separated from the thing that warmed. She looked at Suro. It works, Suro said, as though answering a question she hadn't asked. I have tested it on species with analogous cellular structures. The efficacy data is extensive. Why are you telling us? Mara asked. Suro blinked again, the outside-in blink. I'm sorry. Why are you telling us personally? There are 8 billion people on this planet. You could have gone to a government, a UN building, some kind of a fiddle body. Suro was quiet for a moment. When it spoke again, something had changed in the register of its voice, something more careful, or maybe more honest. I have attempted contact with governmental bodies, it said. On 14 occasions over the past 7 of your years. In 2 cases I was not believed. In 4 cases I was believed, but classified. In 5 cases I was believed, welcomed, studied, and the compound was confiscated for analysis with the intention of replication without distribution. In 3 cases I was shot at. The creek ran over its stones. A bird called from somewhere in the cottonwoods. Okay, Mara said. I recalibrated my approach, Suro said. The decision structures of large-scale institutional bodies involve too many competing incentive systems. The compound, in those contexts, becomes a resource rather than a solution. I determined that the correct point of entry was at a smaller scale. It paused. 2 people beside a creek who were not going to shoot at me. How did you know we weren't going to shoot at you? Dex asked. You don't have weapons. I've had training. Suro looked at him steadily. I know, it said. I've been watching this location for several days. You come here to rest. The person who comes here to rest is not the same person who acts under threat. I was making an inference, Ost. An educated one. Dex was quiet for a moment. Then, yeah, okay. Mara set the cylinder down on the flat stone beside Suro's case. She pulled the cap off her own sunscreen, the SPF 45, the coconut-smelling one, and looked at it, and then she looked at the alien compound with its barely pink iridescence, and she felt something shift in her chest that she would have trouble naming later. Not awe exactly. Something more practical than awe. The feeling of a problem and a solution existing is in the same place at the same time, which is rare enough in a life to notice. Okay, she said. Walk me through it. How does it actually work? The real version, not the diplomatic summary. Suro looked at her. The amber eyes did something that wasn't quite warmth, but was the structural shape of warmth, the architecture of it. You actually want to know, it said. I'm a geologist. I like knowing how things work. I know what geology is. I was going to say it is an unusually good foundation for understanding particulate barrier chemistry at the molecular level. I figured. They sat down together on the flat stones at the creek edge, the geologist and the man who had needed somewhere quiet to be, and Suro talked for an hour. It talked about the molecular structure of the compound, about the way the conversion cascade worked, about the 6 species research project, and the 300 years of iteration, and the 7 failures that had each taught them something the successes hadn't. It talked about solar physics in terms that Mara mostly followed, and that Dex mostly didn't, but that he listened to anyway, with the focused attention he gave things when he'd decided they mattered. At some point, Mara opened the compound again and applied some to her forearms with the same no-nonsense efficiency she'd always applied sunscreen, which was to say, thoroughly and without ceremony. She handed the cylinder to Dex. He looked at it, he applied some. The substance disappeared into his skin the same way it had into hers, and he held his arm up to the light the same way she had, and he made the same small sound. Does it feel different to you? He asked Suro. The sun, when you're here. Suro looked up. It was the first time it had looked directly at the sun since it had arrived, and it did so with the steadiness of something that had grown up under a different one. Yes, it said. Your star is younger than mine. The output has a quality that I would describe as forward, as though it says it intends to do. A pause. I am aware that is not a physical description. No, I know what you mean, Mara said. Suro looked at her. Younger star's different, she said. We can measure it. But there's also something that's harder to quantify, something about the quality of the light in the early morning. Yes, Suro said. Precisely that. They were quiet for a moment with the creek running and the cottonwood leaves doing their specific sound in the wind, that papery shimmer that was one of the sounds Mara associated most with being alive and in a good place. The governmental bodies, she said, they're not going to change. No, Suro said. Not at the pace that would be required, but the compound can be reproduced. The formulation is not complex by the standards of your current chemistry. It requires 2 elements that are less common in your crust but present. The synthesis process I can document. The equipment required is available at your current technological level. If you gave it to a university, Mara said, a chemistry department at a university that wasn't politically compromised, published the formulation openly before anyone could classify it. Suro was very still. That had not been among my modeled approaches. It's a very human approach, Dex said. It bypasses institutional capture, Mara said. It creates multiple simultaneous reproduction points. It's harder to suppress when the suppression window has closed. Suro looked at her for a long time. You have thought about information control, it said. I worked in grant funding for 4 years, she said. You learn. I would need a university that. I know someone, she said. She could see it, the shape of the problem, the shape of the solution, and the places they didn't. It's not fast, it's not a year, but the compound lasts 72 hours per application, and you said mass production is scalable, so if the synthesis documentation is solid enough. It is extensive, Suro said. I brought documentation. I did not know if it would be needed. It reached back into the case and produced something that looked like a matte black square, and when it handed it to Mara, turned out to be a flexible screen cool to the touch, displaying text in a language that was not any human language she knew. Can you translate it? The translation process will take, Suro considered. I will need a space in which to work. Mara looked at Dex. He looked at her. You can sleep on the couch, she said. It's not comfortable, but it works. I do not sleep in a manner that requires a couch, Suro said. Then you definitely won't have a problem with it. She put her sunscreen back in her bag and picked up the alien cylinder and examined it one more time in the light, turning it slowly in her hands. The substance inside shifted its subtle non-liquid movement. She thought about the 6 species and the 400 years and the 7 failures, and she thought about a planet full of people who would need this. Mostly didn't know they needed this, and she thought about all the forces that would try to prevent it from reaching them, because anything that reached a lot of people was, inevitably, a thing someone wanted to control. She thought about her mother's creek, and how she'd come here at 19 with nowhere to put herself, and how the thing that had helped was not any particular wisdom or event, but simply the creek being a creek. The cold water, the flat stones, the papery shimmer of the cottonwoods. How some things just persist in being what they are, indifferent to whether anyone deserves them. She handed the cylinder to Suro. She said. Suro took it. It held the cylinder the way she had held it, turning it in its hands, and she watched its face, watched the amber eyes. Tamai, wherever you'd usually put sunscreen. I do not usually. Where it would do the most good, she said. You said you're going to be here for at least 3 days. You've got a younger star than you're used to. You said yourself it has things it intends to do. Suro looked at the cylinder, then at her, then at the open summer sky above the creek bend. It pressed its fingers to the side of the cylinder, and the top released with its small exhalation of a sound. It applied the compound to the back of its forearms, the bark-textured skin that had weathered several bad winters, with a thoroughness that made Mara think it had in fact been paying attention. There, she said. Yes, Suro said. Dex stretched out again on the bank with his arm over his eyes. I'm going to need someone to explain to me, he said, to no one in particular, why the day an alien shows up with the solution to one of the planet's major problems looks exactly like every other Tuesday. Because you come here on Tuesdays, Mara said. We need to start coming on Wednesdays, then it'll look like every other Wednesday. Suro watched this exchange with the outside-in blink and said nothing, and Mara thought it might be running another calibration. Something about humans, something about the gap between the scale of a thing and the texture of the moment in which it happens. How a species could know the size of the problem and still let the creek run over the stones. How that was not necessarily denial. How it might, in fact, be the only way to get anything done at all. She opened her field guide back to the chapter on ancient lake beds. The science of the compound would take 3 days to translate. The university contacts would take a week to navigate. The open publication would take months and would be fought and would be delayed, and would eventually, through repetition and redundancy and the specific stubbornness of people who had decided a thing mattered, win. But right now the sun was on her shoulders, and the creek was running cold over her flat stones, and the alien compound was doing its quiet work at the molecular level, and the afternoon, which had always intended to be ordinary, continued being ordinary in a way that now contained something it hadn't before. She turned the page. Dex slept. Suro sat with its forearms in the sun and learned what it felt like to be protected by something you'd helped bring into the world, in a place you hadn't expected, among people you hadn't modeled. Overhead, the sky was the particular blue of a young star in a phase of heightened output, full of things it intended to do, pressing down on them all with its warm and indifferent and completely survivable hand.